You've experienced this moment before. Out of nowhere, she reaches out. A message late at night, a sudden call, a familiar voice returning when you least expect it. The timing doesn't make sense. There was distance before, silence, maybe even closure. And now there's intensity, warmth, openness, emotional closeness that feels real, but slightly off. Too fast, too sudden, too unstable. And you mistake it for desire, because that's what men are trained to do. But this isn't about wanting you, not in the way you think. Men often confuse attention with attraction. When a woman reaches out unexpectedly, the instinct is to feel chosen, to feel significant, to believe something has reignited. But what you're feeling isn't desire, it's urgency. And urgency rarely comes from attraction. It comes from discomfort, from a state she's trying to escape. Look at the pattern. She reaches out when something collapses internally, after a breakup, during a low point, when routine loses meaning. When silence gets too loud, the connection feels intense, but it doesn't feel grounded. One moment she's close, open, emotionally present. The next, she pulls back without explanation. And you're left trying to understand what you did wrong, when the truth is far more uncomfortable. When a woman feels empty, she doesn't ask herself who she wants. She asks herself, who can make this feeling stop? This isn't about blame. It's not about labeling her intentions as good or bad. It's about recognizing a mechanism that plays out quietly, again and again. Because emptiness changes behavior. It rewires priorities. It turns people into sources of regulation instead of connection. And once you see that clearly, you stop personalizing intensity that was never about you in the first place. This video isn't about blame. It's about understanding what emptiness does to human behavior. Emptiness is often misunderstood because it looks like loneliness on the surface. But psychologically, they are very different states. Loneliness is about absence. It's the lack of people, connection, or closeness. Emptiness is something else entirely. Emptiness is emotional disconnection from the self. It's what happens when someone feels detached from meaning, identity, or inner coherence, even when others are present. This is why a woman can be surrounded by friends and still feel hollow. Why she can be in a relationship and still feel vacant. Why attention doesn't fix the feeling, even though it briefly distracts from it. Emptiness isn't solved by proximity. It comes from internal fragmentation, the sense that something inside is muted, numb, or disconnected. And when that disconnection grows, the nervous system looks for relief, not relationship. This distinction matters because lonely people and empty people move very differently. A lonely person seeks companionship. They want shared moments, continuity, and presence. They're drawn towards stability. An empty person seeks regulation. They want the feeling to stop. And relief doesn't always come from closeness. It can come from silence, intensity, or stimulation. Something sharp enough to break the numbness. Something strong enough to remind them they still feel. This is why the behavior can seem contradictory. She might withdraw from people she genuinely cares about. She might reach out to someone unexpected. She might crave intensity one moment and disappear the next. It's not about inconsistency. It's about regulation. When emptiness sets in, the nervous system oscillates between wanting quiet to reduce overwhelm and wanting sensation to escape numbness. Loneliness wants connection. Emptiness wants silence or sensation. Once you understand this, her behavior stops looking personal. The late-night message isn't about missing you. The sudden openness isn't about renewed desire. It's about relief. About escaping an internal void that words can't explain. And when you confuse emptiness with loneliness, you step into a role you never agreed to play, the role of emotional anesthetic. Understanding this distinction is the first step to staying grounded, because you stop responding to intensity as if it were intimacy, and you start seeing it for what it really is: a signal of internal disconnection, searching for regulation. When emptiness sets in, it doesn't just sit quietly inside a person. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty. They pull, automatically, without intention, without planning. An emotional vacuum draws energy toward it, the same way physical emptiness draws air. This is why behavior changes so suddenly, and why men often feel pulled into something they don't fully understand. Internally, the experience is muted and restless at the same time. Emotional numbness settles in first. Things that once felt meaningful lose their color. Conversations feel flat. Routine feels heavy. Alongside that numbness comes a loss of meaning, not existential despair, but a quiet sense that nothing is anchoring the day. And then restlessness appears, a low-level agitation, a need for movement, disruption, something to break the internal stillness. When this happens, the nervous system looks outward for contrast, not connection contrast. Intensity becomes attractive because it cuts through numbness. Validation becomes soothing because it temporarily restores a sense of self. Emotional contrast becomes essential because flatness feels unbearable. This is why attention spikes, why emotions run hot, why things move fast without direction. The vacuum is pulling whatever can fill it in the moment. This is where men misread what's happening. They feel the pull and assume it's desire. They feel the intensity and assume it's chemistry. But intensity, created by emptiness, is not attraction. It's stimulation. And stimulation works like medicine. It numbs, distracts, and relieves symptoms temporarily without healing the cause. You can see this pattern clearly in real life. She reaches out when her life feels stalled. She leans into emotional closeness quickly, then withdraws just as fast. She seems present one moment and distant the next. That inconsistency isn't manipulation, it's the vacuum fluctuating. When the stimulation works, she feels better and pulls back. When the emptiness returns, the pull comes back with it. When meaning disappears, stimulation becomes medicine, and medicine wears off. Always. That's why these connections burn hot and destabilize quickly. The man becomes associated with relief, not grounding, with sensation, not stability. And once the emotional hit fades, the vacuum returns, looking for its next source of contrast. Understanding this model changes everything. You stop asking why the connection feels so intense yet unstable. You stop internalizing the pull as proof of desire. You start recognizing the pattern for what it is: an emotional system trying to regulate itself by borrowing energy from the outside. And once you see the vacuum, you stop stepping into it without realizing the cost. The third truth is uncomfortable, precisely because it removes romance from the moment without turning it into accusation. When emptiness is active, people don't choose in the way men imagine choice. They don't sit, compare, and decide. They reach. And reaching is not selection, it's use. Not in a calculated sense, not in a malicious one, but in a nervous system sense. The man becomes a function before he is a person. This is important to understand clearly. In these moments, she is rarely thinking, "I'm using him." The behavior is unconscious, automatic, self-regulatory. The same way someone reaches for noise when silence feels unbearable, or stimulation when numbness sets in. She's not manipulating, she's stabilizing. And the man who answers the pull becomes associated with relief, not identity. That's why the patterns repeat so predictably. She reconnects with an ex, not because he's suddenly the right choice, but because he's familiar. Familiarity lowers effort. It requires no rebuilding. The emotional pathways are already there. Or she reaches out to emotionally safe men, the ones who listen, understand, and absorb. Men who regulate her without resistance. Or she pulls in men with strong presence, because their grounded energy temporarily counteracts her internal fragmentation. In each case, the man serves a function. He calms, he excites, he distracts, he stabilizes, and while the interaction can feel intimate, even intense, it's not rooted in choice. It's rooted in effect. What matters isn't who he is, it's what he produces inside her in that moment. This is where men get hurt. They personalize the attention. They believe they're being chosen, when they're being used as emotional input. And when the input no longer works, when the emptiness shifts, or returns in a different form, the connection dissolves without explanation. Not because he failed, but because the function expired. She's not choosing you. She's choosing the feeling you create. Once you see that, the confusion stops. You no longer mistake emotional urgency for attachment. You stop building meaning where there is only regulation. And most importantly, you stop offering yourself as a tool in moments where no real choice is being made. This is why these connections feel so powerful at the beginning and so disorienting at the end. When emptiness is present, relief feels like oxygen. The moment the interaction begins, the numbness lifts, meaning returns temporarily. Energy flows again, and because the man is the source of that relief, his presence gets linked to something essential. The intensity isn't random. It's chemical. It's the nervous system reacting to the sudden absence of pain. In that phase, everything accelerates. Conversations deepen quickly. Emotional closeness arrives without foundation. She opens up, leans in, mirrors connection to the man. It feels like momentum, like chemistry finally aligning. But what's really happening is that the emptiness has gone quiet, not resolved quiet, and relief, by nature, feels profound while it lasts. The problem is that relief isn't stable. It's temporary by design. Once the nervous system adapts, the stimulation loses potency. The medicine stops working. And when that happens, the emptiness returns not gradually, but abruptly. The same interaction that once soothed now feels neutral, sometimes even suffocating. And without understanding why, she pulls away. This is where the whiplash begins. One day there's intensity, presence, closeness. The next, there's distance, vagueness, withdrawal. The man is left replaying moments, searching for the mistake that caused the shift. But nothing changed in the way he thinks. The source of relief simply expired. And when emptiness returns, it doesn't blame it, redirects. You didn't lose her. The emptiness came back. That distinction matters because it removes false responsibility. You weren't building something that broke. You were filling a void that reopened. And once the nervous system stops associating you with relief, there's no reason for it to stay engaged. The intensity fades as quickly as it arrived because it was never anchored in choice or compatibility. It was anchored in regulation. Understanding this protects you. You stop chasing explanations that don't exist. You stop internalizing emotional reversals that were never about your value. And most importantly, you stop mistaking rapid intensity for depth. Because depth doesn't disappear overnight. Relief does. The fifth truth is where responsibility quietly shifts back to the man. Not as blame, but as positioning. Not every man gets pulled into these moments of emptiness. Certain men are far more likely to be drawn in, while others seem almost invisible to it. The difference isn't status or confidence. It's structural. Empty people attach to open systems, not because they're weak, but because open systems absorb without resistance. The men most at risk are emotionally available in the wrong way. They are receptive, listening, attuned, but also porous. They over-understand. They lean into attention, searching for meaning. When a woman reaches out intensely, they interpret it as significance instead of timing. They open quickly, respond deeply, and provide emotional space without limits. To an empty nervous system, this feels safe, accessible, absorbent. The man becomes an emotional surface that can be leaned on without friction. Seeking meaning and attention makes this worse. The moment a man asks, "Why is she reaching out? What does this mean?" he is already stepping into the role. He begins organizing his identity around the interaction, and emptiness is drawn to that. Not because it wants him, but because it can use him without resistance. Contrast that with men who are least affected. Self-contained men don't close themselves off. They simply don't open automatically. Their emotional center isn't immediately available for regulation. They're grounded. Their rhythm doesn't change because someone reaches out. Their attention doesn't spike with intensity. They don't assign meaning to emotional urgency. And because of that, emptiness has nothing to latch on to. Grounded men don't absorb emotional overflow. They acknowledge it without becoming it. Their presence is felt, but not consumed. They don't take on emotional roles they weren't invited into consciously. And that makes them difficult to use as regulation tools. The emptiness hits them and slides off. Empty people attach to open systems. They bounce off closed ones. Closed doesn't mean cold. It means contained. It means there are boundaries around emotional access. When you understand this, you stop wondering why certain men keep getting pulled into unstable dynamics while others don't. It's not luck, it's structure. And once you change your structure, the pull changes with it. This is where most men turn a temporary situation into lasting damage by misreading intensity and stepping into a role they were never meant to play. When a woman reaches out from emptiness, the emotional charge feels real. The closeness feels accelerated. And the mistake men make is assuming intensity equals commitment. They think, if it feels this strong, it must mean something. But intensity born from emptiness isn't investment, it's urgency. And urgency doesn't build toward choice. It burns through relief and disappears. The next mistake follows naturally becoming emotional support. The man starts listening more, reassuring more, absorbing more. He makes himself available at all hours. He becomes the place where feelings get unloaded and stabilized. This feels generous. It feels mature, but it quietly shifts the dynamic. He stops being a man she's oriented toward and becomes a system she leans on. And systems don't get chosen, they get used until they're no longer needed. Trying to save her is the final collapse. Men see the emptiness and want to fix it. They offer consistency, understanding, presence. They believe if they just show enough care, the connection will solidify into something real. But emptiness isn't solved by another person. It's managed temporarily through them. And when you try to save someone from a state they don't fully understand themselves, you anchor yourself to a problem that will outlast your role. This fails for 3 reasons. First, it reinforces dependency. The more you provide relief, the less she needs to regulate herself. Second, it turns you into an emotional crutch. Your value becomes functional, not relational. You're useful, not chosen. And third, it kills polarity. Desire requires separation, not fusion. The moment you merge into her emotional infrastructure, attraction has nowhere to land. You can feel this shift when it happens. The more supportive you become, the less desired you feel. The more available you are, the less direction the connection has. And when the emptiness changes shape or returns stronger, you're left behind confused, drained, and wondering how something so intense could vanish so cleanly. The moment you become her relief, you stop being her choice. That's not cruelty. It's mechanics. Relief solves symptoms. Choice requires alignment. And the man who understands this doesn't withdraw in bitterness. He simply refuses roles that were never meant to become relationships. Applying this correctly doesn't require you to shut down emotionally or become distant. That's the misinterpretation that turns awareness into avoidance. The goal isn't to disappear, it's to stay intact. You don't harden yourself, you structure yourself, because the problem was never presence. The problem was absorption. The first principle is to observe timing, not words. Words are cheap when emptiness is driving behavior. What matters is when she reaches out. Does contact spike during moments of instability, boredom, or emotional collapse, or does it appear consistently, independent of her internal state? Timing reveals motivation far more accurately than anything she says in the moment. Attention that arrives only when she feels low isn't connection, it's regulation. The second principle is to watch patterns, not moments. Empty-driven interactions feel intense in short bursts, but they don't stabilize over time. One good night, one deep conversation, one emotional exchange doesn't mean alignment. Patterns do. Consistency does. Direction does. If closeness rises and disappears without explanation, that's not chemistry, it's fluctuation. When you stop reacting to moments and start tracking patterns, emotional fog clears quickly. The third principle is not to over-identify with attention. Attention feels good. It triggers significance. but significance is not the same as choice. When you let attention define your value, you step into the emotional vacuum without realizing it. You become available for use instead of alignment. The moment you catch yourself asking, "Why me? What does this mean?" you're already slipping into absorption. Practically, this means maintaining your rhythm. Your life doesn't pause because someone else feels empty. You don't rush intimacy because closeness appeared suddenly. You let things unfold at a pace that reveals stability, not urgency. You don't escalate emotional roles quickly. You don't become the place where feelings get managed. You remain present, but you don't become infrastructure. This balance is subtle, but powerful. You respond without rescuing. You listen without carrying. You engage without reorganizing your life around someone else's internal state. And because you're not absorbent, emptiness doesn't stick to you. It passes through, unanchored. You can be present without being absorbent. That's the distinction most men never learn. Presence creates connection. Absorption creates exhaustion. When you master that line, you stop being pulled into cycles that drain you. And for the first time, you don't confuse intensity with meaning. You let meaning prove itself over time. At the end of this, the shift you're meant to make isn't emotional, it's orientational. This knowledge isn't here to make you suspicious, guarded, or detached. It's here to correct a misreading that costs men their center. Attention is not always attraction. Intensity is not always desire. And the sooner you separate those concepts, the less power emotional turbulence has over you. Most men ask the wrong question when a woman reaches out intensely. Why me? That question flatters the ego but weakens the frame. It pulls you inward. It makes the moment about your worth, your uniqueness, your significance. And that's exactly how you get absorbed. The better question is colder, cleaner, and far more protective. Why now? Why this moment? Why this timing? Why this surge of closeness after distance, instability, or silence? When you ask why now, patterns become visible. You stop romanticizing timing that's driven by an emptiness. You stop personalizing urgency that has nothing to do with choice. You see behavior in context instead of isolation. And once you see context, intensity loses its spell. It becomes information, not validation. This is where identity locks in. You stop defining yourself by who reaches for you in moments of collapse. You stop measuring value through emotional pull. You remain whole, whether attention arrives or disappears. And that wholeness changes how you move. You no longer rush to fill gaps that aren't yours. You don't offer yourself as medicine for states you didn't create. You let people regulate themselves without becoming the tool they use to do it. When a woman feels empty, she will reach outward. That doesn't make her bad. It makes her human. Emptiness seeks relief the way hunger seeks food. But the man who stays intact understands the difference between being wanted and being used for regulation. He doesn't judge the reach, he just doesn't step into it blindly. And that's the final distinction. The man who stays whole is the one who never gets emptied. He can be present without being consumed, available without being absorbed, connected without being drained. He doesn't confuse intensity with meaning or attention with alignment. He lets time reveal what moments cannot. Not all attention is interest. Some of it is relief. And once you internalize that, you stop chasing emotional signals that were never invitations. You remain centered. And because of that, you're never pulled into cycles that leave you hollow in someone else's place.